marginal damage and marginal abatement costs. The viewpoint of society, if we let emissions happen, then we have to incur the damages. If we want to reduce pollution and emissions, then we have to incur the abatement costs. So there's no avoiding that. One of those two costs is happening. And then we start in chapters 11, 12, and 13. So we'll continue with that today. So Samantha has a question. Market failures and government failures. So looking at reducing pollution, the government's just going to have to do it, right? That's correct. Pollution happens because of market failures. If you want it to achieve the lower efficient amount of pollution, then it requires government laws that make it happen. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Firms do not voluntarily incur costs. Maybe I just write this down and make this obvious. I guess I would assume it's obvious, but let's write down. Firms will not incur costs to decrease emissions unless forced to by government laws. Right? They're not just going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. Their job is to minimize costs, not just to add extra costs, unless they're forced to. So again, we're covering this chapter next. So chapter 11 is emission standards. This is primarily what we do now. Right? This is the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. These were passed. I mean, before the 1970s, there was basically no environmental regulations, which is why Lake Erie was a dead lake and on fire with pollution. Right? That was one of the major stories over the Cuyahoga River, bringing so much pollution into Lake Erie that was completely a dead lake and on fire. First page news, the country, elected officials said, one of our Great Lakes is on fire. That's not so great. Maybe we should have laws to reduce pollution. And that's when the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act were passed, which is still our major pieces of legislation today. It's all. I mean, this is 99% standards. So what we're adding today is chapter 12. Emission charges, we call T-star. And we just started that briefly last time. And then chapter 13, the book calls it tradable emission. What does your book call it? Oh, transferable discharge permits. That's right, very down. It's actually transferable. Transferable discharge permits. So we'll talk about that today. But what are these laws we're talking about, right? These are your three options. If you put them into three giant buckets. Right, so these are the efficient laws you need to reduce emissions. This is actually what your book talks about. But also, I mean, it's not just firms, it's citizens too. Or in this case, we'll say consumers. Let's make it qualify it to make it more accurate. Most consumers will not pay extra for more environmentally friendly products unless forced. How does that happen? Well, if you have these laws, right, this happens automatically. You pay more at the store and get less pollution in society. So first of all, this is what we have now. So we have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which has massively reduced pollution. The water is much cleaner. The air is much cleaner. Like again, in the 50s and 60s, planes, like that article I showed you from in LA, which school days were canceled when there was a smog event. Planes were grounded. You couldn't even see. People's lungs were burning. Like awful. And I have a friend who grew up in LA who moved here. Same age as me. So this was in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if you've been to LA, but like he grew up in Pasadena. There's mountains right there. And when he went back as an adult, it was the first time he could stand at his school and look and see the mountains. Didn't even know they're there because you'd never see them. It was just all haze. And now the air is so much cleaner. You can see the mountains. But the point of what I'm emphasizing is the air quality is dramatically improved. We are not yet even close to. So let's just look at what we did in chapter 5. So let's just say the emissions is particulate matter 2.5. This is Emax. We were here in 1960 for sure. Like we weren't even trying. Not even any catalytic converters on cars. So this is the marginal abatement cost. Go this way, and this is E star. So this is below. So this is the total damage it's efficient to incur, and this is the total abatement cost it's efficient to incur. And we made incredible progress, like way better. So in the year now, 2024. Right? Massive progress, but I can prove it that it's efficient to do more. Because I just showed you that article that says these small particulate matters, there's no threshold, right? It's affecting our health. You can't see it, right? This is the width of a hair. And so you can't see it, but you're breathing it in and it's affecting your brain and your lungs and it's affecting your ability to learn. And it looks like this outside, right? So that's the science. The science informs us of where the marginal damage is. And the science informs us, well, how expensive is it going to be? It's not expensive. We're just not implementing a loss. So we aren't going to go from here to here. It's not going to happen unless you strengthen the Clean Air Act and make it happen. Right? So we made incredible progress, but we are not yet at E-star. Right? That's what we showed. Just a quick review of chapter 5. So, but I also want to add, because we had these laws, these are extra costs. Firms have had to incur these costs to put a catalytic converter on a car, make the car more efficient so that you burn less gasoline as you drive it. Energy utilities put scrubbers when we burn coal, and so all these reduce emissions. There is a cost, and that cost is going to get passed on to you as a consumer. And so you are going to pay more for things at a store a little bit. But again, catalytic converter has a $200 cost to a car. It's not even that expensive. The average new car now is $45,000. So it's a little bit of extra cost incurred onto you. To get that less pollution. But again, if we did have these regulations, the example I gave last time, lawnmower, I'm sure there's some company out there making a gas-powered lawnmower that has efficient emission regulations in it, but you go buy the cheap one. So everybody cares about their pocketbook. Firms care about their pocketbook. You care about your pocketbook. Nothing changes until you have one. And then most, right? Some consumers are going to incur extra costs upon themselves because they care so much about the environment. Some firms will voluntarily reduce emissions, but 9 times out of 10, it's not going to happen unless you have loss. So that's looking at them. Samantha, I just feel like society wouldn't want to do it. Okay, so we got to be careful about the term society. Firms are never going to want to do it. So firms never like to have costly environmental regulations placed on them. So yeah, that's correct. But when you say society, you also got to include citizens, and that's through the political process. And there have been many surveys done that show average citizens support stronger environmental regulations, including solving climate change. So it's a government failure that the government is not implementing the will of citizens to do that. And so that solves the free rider problem. You may not voluntarily go to the store and pay a little extra for something that's going to lead to cleaner air, but you would vote and you want there to be stronger laws that just force it to happen. So you go to the store and everybody has to pay a little extra. That solves the free rider problem. So Olivia asks, my question is, what is stopping them from doing it? If they can emit emissions and just pay the charge, what is stopping them from doing it? So Macy, also similar question. So maybe that should lead with this down here to answer both Olivia and Macy's point. Think of it this way: with an emission charge, again, firms have 2 choices. So we did this right at the end of class last time. If you can either let the emission happen and then you pay the charge, like you only have to pay the T-star per unit of emissions if you do nothing and you let the emission come out of your pipe of your factory, and then it's just every emission comes out T. This is the charge that you pay. Now this is a cost that firms cannot avoid, and they hate it. And hating it is the point. So if you don't want to pay that, then you voluntarily choose to abate that emission, so it doesn't come out of the pipe, so you don't have to pay that T-star. And so when firms choose to do that, they would choose to do that if it was cheaper, that they could include some technology so that their marginal abatement cost is less than that. Then they will do this because it saves them money. Right? So the point is now the firm cannot emit pollution for free. It's you are either going to pay money to abate the emission so it doesn't go out the pipe, or you pay T-star out the pipe. And so now firms maximizing profits and minimizing costs will choose whichever option is cheaper. And so they may have the ability, and big firms can always pay T-star, but they're in the business, but they want to minimize their cost of producing something. So if it's cheaper to abate it, then they will. That's I think the key point there, to see that they will abate that. So I think that answers Olivia and Macy's question. Renee, last question, Renee here. So if we had these charges, and let's say it was on natural gas plants, I mean, coal is being phased out, but still continuing to be on natural gas plants. I mean, would they want to raise prices? Yes. All utilities are regulated as a natural monopoly, and so there's a government oversight board that if a utility wants to charge more, they have to get approval. If they say, if we did these emission charges on natural gas, are they going to let them pass that on? Yeah, yes, they would. They would let them pass it on, and anybody buying natural gas would pay more. So that would get passed on to consumers. Renee's public transportation, like buses. If buses were running on regular fuel or natural gas, it would be more costly. And we do have an issue of funding public transportation, so maybe there would be less buses. So absolutely, that's true. It could be a good point. That could happen. So again, the way economists look at this, what we'll talk about today, is incentives. You do want to place a price on fossil power, so utilities start trying to find substitutes away from natural gas, definitely away from coal, but also away from natural gas. And therefore, you have increased incentives to use renewable power because fossil power is more expensive. Passing it on to households, if you use natural gas to heat your home and it's more expensive, great. Now we've given households the incentive to next time put in an electric heat pump. Stop using natural gas. Electric heat pumps are a technology that now exists. I don't understand it, but I'm told it's a reverse air conditioner. You can actually take the heat out of cold air from the outside and bring it in and heat the house, so just plugging in electricity. right? So the future is going to be electrify everything. Everything in the house runs on electricity, your car runs on electricity, and electricity is generated with renewable sources of energy. And then fossil power is zero. Right? Completely eliminated it from cars and from heating our houses. So except for flying planes and making cement are a few things that are, the technology is not quite there yet. But in those cases, then you can use hydrogen, and then you can generate hydrogen from renewable sources of energy. So public transportation. The thing I want to emphasize, big picture, is that what I bring in lots of articles and I show you, just understand the world as it is. The world as it is all choices we have made. Just through history and inertia is kind of where we're at. We made the choice in the 1950s to be entirely a car-centered society. Right? We blew up neighborhoods and put in highways so that we can get people from the suburbs to downtown as quickly as possible, with little regard to neighborhoods or the pollution that's being thrown off from these interstates. And just really didn't invest at all in public transportation past 1950. So the East Coast, Boston has a subway, New York, Washington, D.C., because that was pre-car. But from here west, it's primarily all car-centered because that was after cars built up. That was a choice. And then we made roads free, right? We just pay taxes and that builds roads for free. Generally, you can park, and we actually have laws that mandate parking. Every building has to have parking. So, but you got to pay to ride the bus. That's a choice. We didn't have to do that. So why is driving on the road free and parking is free? And we've heavily subsidized cars, but you got to pay to ride the bus. I mean, that is the choices we've made, but we didn't. You didn't have to do that. If we had these carbon fee or any kinds of these emission charges, a tiny percent of that could be given to completely make public transportation free, right? Like gasoline's a little more expensive because the carbon tax would filter through to gasoline. Take some of that money and just give it to TARTA and say, how much do you need? Here you go. Anybody can get on the bus. Don't even measure it. Anybody can ride the bus for free. That is a choice we could make. If there was a concern of public transportation being funded, right? We could do that. In the future, those buses will be electric, powered by renewable sources of energy. And as we talked about, if we have electric buses powered by renewable sources of energy that anybody can ride on for free, that helps also the congestion issue, right? And so public transportation is great to reduce the congestion on roads and minimize accidents, which are two external costs that happen even if all of our cars end up electric. And as we talked about at the beginning of the semester, talk about this? Maybe we did. Electric cars the cost per mile to drive them is going to be lower. So therefore, by the law of demand, when something becomes cheaper, we do more of it, which means once we move towards electric cars, we're going to drive the cars more and they're going to be bigger, which means we are going to have more congestion issues, more accident issues, more external costs from big, heavy electric cars crashing into old gas cars. So public transportation helps with that. So my point is that this Econ toolbox, once you learn it, right, you just carry it around. It never changes. The toolbox never changes. So it's kind of some big picture summary of kind of what we talked about this semester. Okay, so we're continuing with chapters 11, 12, and 13. Chapter 11 is emission standards. 12 is emission charges. Chapter 13 is transportable discharge permits. It's more commonly known as cap and trade. So, I mean, 99% of everything we've done so far is a standard, command and control. Right? The Cleaner Act and the Clean Water Act are just laws that say they're either emission standards or they're technology standards. It's the Cleaner Act and Clean Water Act. That's all Chapter 11. The government just mandates with laws with these legally binding standards. Emission standards, there's just a legal limit on how much emissions can occur. If you're a plant, you are allowed to have a certain amount of emissions come out of your pipe into the air or the water, but there's a limit on it, and you're going to have a big fine if you exceed that. Or it's just a technology standard, where the government requires the use of certain technology to lower emissions, which do not. So that's also true. Government requires pollution sources. You have to include this technology that lowers emissions. You don't get to choose it. We're saying you have to do it. Like a scrubber on a coal plant or a catalytic converter in a car. You can't sell a car without a catalytic converter. That's illegal. So that's primarily what we've done so far. So we almost always use standards. So your book talks about why. I mean, it appears to be simple and direct. Pollution is bad, and we want to make it illegal and limit it. And so standards do that. And they're generally uniform standards, meaning it's just the same standard for everybody for firms that are emitting pollution that they must follow. And so what we're going to add is chapters 12 and 13. In many instances, economists would prefer emission charges or transferable discharge permits. Your book calls them incentive-based policies. So we'll continue talking about today why are these policies give better incentives to reduce pollution. So we'll talk about that. So to begin with, we started our simple story last time, made up numbers to get us started. So this is just hypothetical, super simple story. I have no idea if for some emission, if an aluminum plant costs 5 times a paper plant. I'm just making up a simple example to demonstrate the theory. And then, to put specific numbers to it, I usually bring in an article and say, oh, this article says, these are actual numbers. This is just made up. I'm just making this up to demonstrate how to compare emission charges. So we're saying, let's assume a paper plant has a lower marginal abatement cost of $100 per E. So we did the marginal abatement cost curve back in chapter 5. So to just say it's a constant 100, that's just saying, right now the paper plant is emitting 10 years of emissions. If it wants to reduce it from 10 to 9, it must incur $100. If it wants to decrease it from 9 to 8, it must incur another $100. 7, another 100. Right? So again, total abatement cost is you always add up the marginals. And so if we're reducing from 10 to 8, then the total abatement cost is $200. That's the area under the marginal abatement cost curve. So you can see in chapter 5, we more realistically showed the marginal abatement cost like this. Now we're just making it simple and say, well, let's just say it's always 100. It's just to make it easy. So you still read it from right to left. It's just, we just made it a constant, it's always $100 for the paper plant. And for the aluminum plant, we just made it $500 instead of $100. So now if you're reducing it from 10 to 9, supposed to be 8, you incur $500. If you reduce it from 9 to 8, you incur $500. So if you're going to reduce it from 10 to 8, you would incur $1,000. Okay, so again, the total is just the area under the marginal. So it's the same as what we did in chapter 5. I just made it simpler. It's just a constant $500. So let's say upstream, we got the paper plant and the aluminum plant are both putting emissions into the river, 10 each. So the river has 20 emissions in total, and this is causing bystanders downstream, maybe city intake, has to incur extra costs to eliminate those emissions so that drinking water is safe. It affects beach goers, right? So people go to the beach less. Maybe it affects homes, property values. Maybe this is just like the algal bloom problem we talked about. So we can say that these bystanders are incurring some external costs from the paper and the aluminum, or we can say they are incurring marginal damage from the emissions coming down the river. Right? So that's, if we use the term external costs from paper and aluminum, right? That means external cost from the private good causing the pollution, or they're incurring marginal damage from the E. Right? The marginal damage from the emissions coming down the river. It's just we want to talk about the good causing the emissions as an external cost, or we don't want to just look at the emissions separate from the good causing it, marginal damage. This was chapter 4. This is chapter 5. It's the same. It's the same dollars. It's just whether we're attaching it directly to the E or we're attaching it to the good causing the E. So that's our setup. So we did this right at the end of class last Wednesday, this in-class exercise. So let's start with a uniform emission standard. Uniform just means same for everybody. All firms have the same standard. And so the uniform emission standard is each firm, let's say the Clean Water Act says, you can legally emit up to 5 emissions. But you're violating the Clean Water Act, and the EPA can come fine you. And let's say the fines are so big that you aren't going to break the law. Let's say the fine is $1,000 per emissions if you break the law. So this number is so big, we just want to make sure this number is big enough that we know the paper plant is going to follow the law, and they're going to choose to emit 5. And the aluminum plant is going to follow the law, and they're going to choose to emit 5. They are not going to go above 5 because they don't want to pay this massive fine. So they're going to choose 5, and now we're just looking at, well, what is their total abatement cost? They're at 10 now, to go from 10 to 5. And so the answer made it simple. Again, since you can see here, since the number is always 100 for the paper plant, they always incur a cost of $100 per emission to get rid of it. So they have to abate from 10 down to 5. So they got to reduce emissions by 5. So their total abatement cost is 500. The aluminum plant has a abatement cost per E of 500. So 500 times 5 is 2,500. And then I also asked aggregate. This is the AGG is aggregate. So the aggregate total abatement cost is you just add up across all the firms. So in aggregate, how much abatement cost has been incurred across all of the firms to reduce emissions. So we just add the paper plant spent 500, the aluminum plant spent 2,500, so that's $3,000. So the aggregate total abatement cost was $3,000 to cut emissions in half in the river. So now we only have 10 being emitted instead of 20. So then last thing is compare that to an emission charge. Let's say instead there's an emission charge at T star of $150. And so what the emission charge means, that answers the question first. Okay. Instead, this was a question at the end of class last night. Assume an emission charge of T star $150 per unit of E. So what the emission charge, what this means is you have to have a meter at the end of the pipe anyway to measure if the firm is violating the Clean Water Act and that they're only emitting emissions equal to the amount they're permitted to equal. Right? You got to have the meter there anyway to make sure they're not violating the Clean Water Act. And so what this is saying is the meter is there, but now saying you can legally emit up to 5, and then after that, massive fine. Just say do whatever you want, but every emission coming out of that pipe, we're going to bill you $150. That's the change. Right? So the change is you can have as much emissions coming out of the pipe as you want, but we're going to charge you $150 for every E that comes out of the pipe. So now how is the firm going to respond? So you got to look to see, we expect firms are going to minimize costs. That's what their entire existence is to do, is to produce the things we want in the least cost way. And so now they're going to do the same thing with emissions as they do for every input cost. So they would, so how much are they going to choose? What the key is you have to compare their marginal abatement cost to the 150. Right? So if they can abate for less than 150, do that. It's cheaper to get rid of the emission than to let it happen and pay the 150. And so the paper plant here, last time, so that's what the paper plant is true for them. We said it's only going to cost them $100 to put that technology in place, to put something in place to $100 per E so the emissions don't go out the pipe. So any engineer, the CEO is to ask the engineer, should we put this technology in place or just let the emissions happen and pay the 150? Right? The engineer is going to run numbers and say, well, it only costs us 100 to get rid of it, and that's better than 150. We'll save $50 for every E. So yes, do it. Put the technology in place. And since it's the same, right, then you completely eliminate. Because it's cheaper for the paper plant to abate, they're going to save $50 for every unit of E. Right? So therefore, they're going to choose to eliminate all their emissions. Not because they suddenly started caring about emissions. They're going to do that because it's cheaper. Right? That's the point. And so their total abatement cost then is going to be $1,000. Right? This is the key. Right? You've given the firm the incentive. We are going to abate, not because we now suddenly started caring, but because it's cheaper than that. Okay, so that's what we did last time. So continue. We've got to do the paper. That was the paper. We're going to do aluminum plant, and we got to do tradable permits. So again, connecting this back. Again, each chapter does not negate what we did prior to that. We're just adding to it. So in chapter 5, right, we did this. Now what we can add is this MAC is aggregate. All firms. We said E star is going to be wherever the aggregate marginal abatement cost and marginal damage intersect, because then we minimize total social cost to society. Total damage if you let it happen, and total abatement cost if you reduce it. So we did that as a proof, right? So E star minimizes total social cost. So connected to the story we're doing here, let's say this aluminum plant and paper plant. If we do nothing, there's 20 emissions from the aluminum plant and the paper plant coming down the river. And let's say the EPA has determined that E star is at 10. Not zero, because why not zero? Because it's too expensive, right? The marginal damages aren't very high if E is low, but it gets really expensive to reduce it, right? So we just go this way, keep going, stop. So it is efficient to cut the pollution of this certain emission into the river from 20 down to 10. So we got to cut it in half to achieve E star. And so let's say so we did last time the emission standard. The EPA steps in and says, paper plant, you cut it to 5, aluminum plant, you cut it to 5, done, we've achieved 10. That's primarily what we've done with the Clean Water Act. So now we're comparing that again to what if we did instead emission charges or tradable permits. So it's efficient to reduce E from 20 to 10. Now the goal, from economics, the goal here is we want to achieve E star, just like we said back in chapter 5. But we want to do it in the least cost way. Like why spend extra abatement cost to get from 20 to 10 if we don't have to? So we want to get to E star in the least cost way, meaning we want to minimize the aggregate total abatement cost across all of the firms. And so in here, we're going to keep it super simple. We just have two firms, the aluminum plant and the paper plant. And so where we're heading is we showed the paper plant can abate emissions for $100, but the aluminum plant is $500. Right? They're low cost and high cost. So if we want to minimize the aggregate total cost, what might be a better way here than to go cut emissions by 5? I mean, who do we want to abate more emissions? This is the true situation here. Paper, yeah. I mean, if paper can really cheaply get rid of all their emissions, and then the aluminum plant doesn't put any pollution controls in place, you still went from 20 to 10. It was just all the paper plant. But that's the cheaper way to do it. Why incur higher costs if you don't have to? If we can achieve E star the cheaper way, that's going to be the point here. And so that means then when you go to the store to buy paper and aluminum, that cost is going to get passed on to you, but we've minimized the cost you're going to see as a consumer. Paper is going to be a little more expensive, but it's really reduced pollution a lot. And if we use a charge, aluminum is going to be a little more expensive because that charge is going to get passed on to you. But that charge was less than if we told aluminum, you have to cut emissions no matter how expensive it is. When you go to buy aluminum, or a Ford F-150 buys aluminum, for the truck, or you go buy an aluminum bike, that cost increase passed on to aluminum is lower with the charge than if we just made them use a really expensive technology that they then had to pass on to you. It always gets passed on to you. We're just trying to minimize that cost from the viewpoint of society. That's the goal. All right, so let's see it. Remember, practice this now then for the aluminum plant. We did the paper plant. We do the, so how far back here do I go? I got to go back to, I just need to show you this. So you're doing aluminum. Okay. This, just to practice again, make sure you do it right. We did the aluminum paper plant last time, you do the aluminum plant. So the aluminum plant's marginal abatement cost is 500. The law is you can emit whatever you want, but the charge, T star, is 150 coming out for everyone coming out your pipe. What's the aluminum plant going to do and what? What's their total abatement cost going to be? And this is the same charge, so then what's the aggregate total abatement cost when you compare back to the aluminum plus paper? So I guess I do need to show that as well. Answers. Okay. Anyway, no, can't see it all. Okay, so it's, right, the answer's sitting right here, right? You just compare which number smaller, do that. So what is, how much emissions is the aluminum plant going to abate? They're emitting 10, they could reduce it to 0, or they could do nothing. What are they going to do? Nothing. That's cheaper. Right? The CEO asked the engineer, they're going to start charging us 150 every emission's coming out of the pipe. I don't like this. Let's do better. The engineer comes back and says, sorry, can't do better. You want to avoid that? Then with the technology in place to avoid it is 500. And the CEO says, okay, we'll just pay the 150 then. Because that's cheaper. You're not going to incur this if you can just pay that. So the answer here is the aluminum plant, their marginal abatement cost is greater than the charge. That's the cheaper option, so you just pay the charge. So you emit 10 and you abate 0, because that's the cheapest option. So that means then your total abatement cost is 0. You didn't abate anything. You did nothing, and you just let the emissions come out and you pay the charge. Now this would be a problem if both plants were doing that, but I set the emission charge, so one plant emitted everything and one plant did nothing, right? It was right in the middle. So the aluminum plant did nothing and incurred no abatement costs, but the paper plant reduced, they abated all their emissions at 100 each, at 1,000. So the aggregate total abatement cost here was $1,000. It was all the paper plant. The aluminum plant did nothing, but we don't care who gets rid of the emissions. We just want this number to be as small as possible to cut the emission in the river in half. So now let's add a term your book talks about called deadweight loss. It's a kind of a silly term that economists use. Deadweight loss is just in dollars, how far away are we from efficiency? And so here, our efficiency goal is to cut emissions in the least cost way. We want to minimize the aggregate total abatement cost. That's our goal here. And so what we just showed, if you compare your answers from last Wednesday, our conclusion is with the standard to cut emissions in half, we showed the aggregate total abatement cost was $3,000. $500 from paper, $2,500 from aluminum to cut pollution in half. But now, with the emission charge, we just showed it was $1,000. And we also cut pollution in half. So the deadweight loss is $2,000. Why, as a society, do we want to incur costs of $3,000 to cut the pollution in half when we could have done it for $1,000? We just wasted. We just took $2,000, put it in a pile, and burned it. So uniform emission standard just caused $2,000 of waste, right, inefficiency, deadweight loss. We just burned $2,000 for no reason. So that with these simple numbers here, that's what we're showing. So that's what I've written down here. Right. So in words, why spend $3,000 to cut emissions in half when we can do it for $1,000? That's the point. And the key is, of course, we've shown that we achieved E star either way. With the standard, we cut emissions from 20 to 10, and with this is why it's T star. Right? T star means it's the efficient optimal tax. That also leads us to E star. Right? So T star leads to E star. We have the tax just right. So we also achieve the efficient amount of emissions. So again, these simple numbers show why T star is more efficient. Here it's the least cost. Because firms do have heterogeneous costs, right? Just means very fancy term for they each have different costs. We showed the aluminum plant is 5 times more expensive to abate emissions than the paper plant. And that's pretty typical. Like some firms can get rid of emissions more cheaply and some is harder due to their production process, and it's going to cost more. So hopefully this is intuitive that if we want to reduce emissions in the least cost way, then we want the low cost firms to abate more. That's the paper plant, which then allows to get the same emission reduction, then that allows the high cost firms to abate less, which is the aluminum plant here. And if you're looking downstream, it does not matter if the emissions come from the paper plant or the aluminum plant. The bystanders don't care. Bystanders just know these emissions are causing external costs or marginal damage. And it is efficient to get that pollution to cut in half. Right? You go out outside and you're breathing particulate matter of 2.5. It does not matter to your brain and lungs where those tiny width of a hair particles came from. They cause damage to your brain and your lungs. Doesn't matter what the source was. The goal of society is to reduce particulate matter of 2.5 that you breathe into your body. Doesn't matter where they come from. So the point is then with emission charges, we can get that pollution reduced that we breathe in the least cost way to society, rather than just saying everybody out there, there's a uniform standard, you all got to cut your pollution in half. You just guaranteed that you are forcing all of us to pay more for things in the store to get that less pollution that we breathe in. That's so that's why emission charges are more efficient. So hopefully, I mean, that's pretty much makes sense, right? If some firm can reduce emissions in a lower cost way, we want them to do more. An emission charge achieves that automatically. What questions do you have on that? So if you as a consumer, you just care about going to the store, getting pollution reduced. We reduced particulate matter 2.5. But you also want to go to the store and not have that price passed on to you more than it needs to be. Also emission charge is better than emission standard. Because if we make the aluminum plant incur really high costs, then when you go buy a car with aluminum in it, that's passed on to you. And you're going to pay more for the car than you otherwise would have to. Okay, so one thing that's missing. What did I leave out here with this emission charge? Does it seem like I'm missing something? So just $1,000 is coming from the paper plant. This is all abatement cost. And the aluminum plant is not abating anything, so we said they have no cost. But is there a cost to the aluminum plant that they care about? Yeah. 1,500 taxes, where's that? It's not. We didn't talk about it. So that's a transfer payment. You can take my benefit cost class and I will drill this all semester. Transfer payment. That is revenue transferred from one group to another, so you just ignore it. Yes, the aluminum plant is paying $1,500 in taxes because they chose to not abate emissions. Where does that $1,500 go? Well, it goes to the government, and then they use it to just fund government that we have to do anyway. I mean, we just ignore it. It's efficient to ignore that as a transfer payment. So the aluminum plant has no abatement cost. This is what we're focusing on. Like we're focusing on this. But they are paying a tax bill of $1,500, which they don't like. But we ignore this as a transfer payment because we assume you got to fund. The government has to raise tax revenue somehow anyway. And so, this $1,500 we assume is going to just go to funding something that citizens care about in some way. Like we are assuming the government does not collect this $1,500 and just put it in a pile and burns it. Like, it somehow is getting this recycled back to society in a way that's not wasteful. But notice, let's see, these numbers add up here. So if we added, that is true. So even if you added this back in, I like to do this just to kind of show that waste is waste. So let's say the government, just a silly example, did take this $1,500 and they collected it from the aluminum plant, and then they just took the money and burned it. And so it really is waste now. So we should, from the viewpoint of efficiency, add that in. Do we still want to do the emission charge where we burn all the revenue, we just literally put pound burn the money, or do the uniform emission standard? Which way is still cheaper? Emission charge. That's the point. Waste is waste. Right? You're literally burning money. If you take a uniform emission standard and you require society to spend $3,000 versus $1,000, you burn $2,000. Well, this way you're only burning $1,500 if you actually burn the money. But we're not going to do that. Right? The point is we have a not corrupt functioning government generally. That means there have been a few officials who've gone to jail for taking bribes and doing corrupt things, but 999 times out of 1,000, it's not happening. So this $1,500 would just offset some other taxes or use it for something that the average voter wants to support. And again, this brings us back to the idea of double dividend. That is revenue that you could use for something. The government could use that $1,500. You can either lower other taxes, right, just lower income taxes or sales taxes or property taxes or other taxes we pay, or going back to other market failures, you can subsidize. You have two options. The only way a subsidy is efficient, we've identified. You either are subsidizing a public good or you're subsidizing a private good that causes an external benefit. So you have money now to do one of those two things. So you can solve two market failures at the same time. That's the double dividend. The emission charge, we've lowered emissions in the least cost way, and we have money to go do some subsidies for something else that we do want more of. That's the idea of the double dividend. Like you could have research and development, right? You can just give it back to the firms and say, this emission charge, you could give it to the aluminum plant and say, here's the money back, but you have to use it for research and development to find a new way so you also can lower emissions more cheaply. We know you haven't tried, so go start trying and see if you can reduce emissions in a cheaper way. Right? You can do that. And so that's why, well, I'll come back to that. The transport district from this group, we'll come back to that. So generally, big picture here is there's two questions for government. One, what is the efficient role for government in a market economy? Well, the first thing is just protect property rights. I mean, you must have police and have laws, and no one can steal from anybody, and that's just basic. You must have national defense. And what we are identifying also is the efficient role for government is to solve market failures, right? And this is an environmental econ class, so we're talking about a private good causing external costs, handling pollution, or it's a public good or a common open access resource, right? Those market failures. Well, how are we going to fund the police and national defense and regulators to make sure we're minimizing pollution rules that we follow? But you got to raise revenue somehow. Well, the most efficient solution is collective taxes or emission charges. Achieve that. So back in chapter 5, we did this graph, right? And we proved E star is the emission that minimizes total social cost. So what we're adding here is how do we get to E star? Well, an emission charge set directly at 150 is where we would firms would choose. And this is the only thing the government has to do is say set the charge at 150 and let every firm make its own choice. Where we're going to end up at is E star in total, right? Because firms will choose to abate, stop, and then that's how you would achieve that. But here we've made it very simple. We just said that the paper plant can abate emissions. Its marginal abatement cost is a constant 100, and the aluminum plant's abatement cost is a constant 500. And so that's why the emission charge just has to be between these two numbers, right? And there's kind of no reason to set it higher than it needs to be. So I just put it at 150, right? Because then if we are at 150, we know the paper plant is going to abate all of its emissions because this 100 is less than 150, so we've got to cut in half at 10. And the aluminum plant just stays at 10 because if we set it at 150 here, right? So we set it at RT. 150, right here. So the paper plant abates 10, and the aluminum plant does nothing. That's right in the middle. So what I'm leading here to is, well, why don't we just set the emission charge at $550? Why don't we set the emission charge at $550 so both firms abate all of the heat? And they choose to do that. What's the problem based on what we've learned? Why don't we just set it at $550?
It makes the products way more expensive, like the customers will experience.
When it comes to you, that is correct. Yes, and so that's correct. But stepping back into this graph that leads to that, what would we say? Why is it more expensive to you? That's correct. What are we showing in this graph that leads to that?
Your neck is too high.
Your what?
Your neck becomes too
Yep.
high.
They're marginal. You've incurred them too much marginal abatement cost to reduce emissions, which then leads to the prices being too high when you go to the store. So yes, you're both correct. So if we set it at 550, how would the firms respond? We would end up at E equals 0. They would both abate. Now, if you were if your goal as an environmentalist is to ignore costs and to just make minimum marginal damage to 0 is your entire goal, and you don't care about dollars, and that is actually about what costs are to society, then you'd be happy with this. But the goal of this class is we are treating marginal damage costs and marginal abatement costs as equal dollars. And so our goal is to be at E star, not get to 0. And so we would say then that all of this extra abatement cost that we are forcing the aluminum plant to occur would be extra total social cost from the viewpoint of society of reducing emissions too much. Right? So again, most of the time we're over here. We're doing something, but not enough. But this would be too much based on, unless we got some new knowledge that the marginal damage from this emissions is so high, we do want to be at 0. That's what we're showing there. So again, what we're adding in chapters 11, 12, and 13 is just building off of what we already did in 5, which is building off of what we did prior in chapter 4, right? It's all connected. Okay, so what if, all right, so let me ask it the other way. What if T was set to 50? What would happen if the emission charge was $50? How much emissions gets abated? How much emissions gets abated if we set the charge at $50? None, right? Because then it's too low. Even the paper plan says, forget it, we'll just pay the 50 because that's less than 100. Right? So you got to get the T just right. You can't set it too low because then nobody does anything. But you can't set it too high so everybody does everything. You got to set it right in the middle. You got to set it right in the middle, just right, so you achieve E star. Now you could say, well, we don't. The government may not know what firms' abatement costs are. Like that's their private information, right? So you may have to iterate. Where if you first set it too low, you wait a year and you'd be like, oh, you didn't do enough. All right, we're going to crank it up. You just keep cranking it up until you get the emission reduction that you want. If you set it too high, and you can back it off. So we are assuming government has the ability to adjust emission charges once you see how firms actually respond. Right, so we're saying here, if you set it at 50, then it's too low. Right? Then nobody does anything, and then you don't get any emissions abated. So that hasn't achieved E star. All right, so now we got to do transferable discharge permits. So let's continue with our simple story. We did the uniform emission standard. We showed it caused deadweight loss of $2,000. We showed if it's T star, right, it has to be T just right of 150, not 50, not 550, but 150. That leads us to get to E star, and it leads us to minimize the aggregate total abatement cost. We reduce E to E star in the least cost way. So that's what we've done so far. So this was proposed, this is called Pagovi taxes. This was proposed 200 years ago. And in the 60s and 70s and 80s, this really took off to show that we could do this. But it's practically never done. Firms hate it, so they lobby very hard against it. So instead, then economists said, well, how can we achieve the same thing but not have a tax or charge? So that's when economists started researching transferable discharge permits, and then this has been used a few times. So this is chapter 13. What does this mean? So this is an illegal allowance to have a 1 unit of emissions per permit. This starts out like an emission standard, but the key is they're transferable. They're tradable. These permits are tradable. They can be bought and sold from one firm to another. So you start with a uniform standard, but then you say, but you can buy and sell permits from each other. That's the key. The transferable part is key. So let's assume that the government gives both firms 5 permits. So we give the paper plant 5 permits, and we give the aluminum plant 5 permits. And let's say that the price of the permit is going to be $150 if they want to buy and sell them from each other. So let's just start with the paper plant. Right? The paper plant now has 3 options. This one's a little more complicated than the emission charge. Emission charge, you just compare the abatement cost to the tax. But here, the paper plant has 3 options. You were given 5 permits for free, so you can just stay there and emit 5. You don't have to buy and sell permits. But if you want to change, you can either buy permits or you can sell. You can do nothing, or you can buy or you can sell. If you buy some permits at 150, then you can emit more than 5. Right? If you have 10 permits, then you can let all the emissions come out of your pipe, and you just show the government, hey, you tracked us. We had 10 units of emissions coming out of your pipe. Here are 10 permits that legally say we can do that. So you can just buy permits and emit more, or some of those permits you were given, you could sell them to somebody else at 150. But if you sell them to somebody else, you have to lower your emissions. Right? You have legally sold off your right to emit pollution. And so the paper plan here, we're going to say their marginal abatement cost is the same at $100. All right, so here's your next in-class exercise. So put your economist hat on again, and you're the CEO of the paper plant, and these are your choices. This is your abatement cost, and these are the price of permits. What is optimally fit for you to do to minimize your costs? So are you going to just keep your 5 permits and do nothing? Or are you going to go buy some permits? Or are you going to sell some permits? So your option, you got to choose 1, 2, or 3, and why. So answer that and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so the key information here is you know what your marginal abatement cost is, and you know what the price of the permit is. So what are you going to do to minimize costs? And actually maximize profits. All right, so what are you going to do and why? Are you going to do nothing? Are you going to buy permits? Or are you going to sell permits? And why did you make that choice?
Sell permits just so they can profit up to dealers.
Correct. So you just compare these two numbers, and you can sell permits for 150, and you go ask your environmental engineer. It'd be great if we could reduce our emissions and sell some of these permits. Can we reduce emissions at cheaper than 150 so we can sell them? And the engineer says, hey, I got great news. We can. We can abate for 100. And so every emission we abate, we can turn around and sell it for 150 and make $50. And our shareholders are really happy now that we made extra profits. So that's what they do, right? So that it's cheaper to abate because if they abate it, they haven't incurred 100, but they get to turn around and get 150, right? So you're going to abate and sell. So that's correct. So how many emissions are they going to emit? None, right? Because it's a constant 100. It's always cheaper to abate and sell. So they reduce their emissions to 0. They abate 10. They got 5 for free, and then they sold 5 permits at $50 extra. So their abatement cost is the same as before, right? They abated everything for $1,000. How much revenue did they get? I think I have it written down here, right? Yeah, Williams pointed out. They got 5 for free, but they're going to sell the other 5 permits for $150, and so they get $750 in revenue. What do you think is going to be true for the aluminum plant if they have, now just change this number to 5, now we're going to say the aluminum plant, change that number to 500. What's the aluminum plant going to do? 5 permits, because this is cheaper than abating. The aluminum plant has, I didn't ask this in the class exercise, you just had to do the paper, but you can see the same logic for the aluminum plant. Their marginal abatement cost is 500, and you just look to see which one's cheaper. This is expensive. Let's just go buy some permits. So obviously, if you have only 2 people, right? If we're saying the paper plant is selling 5 permits, who's buying them, right? The aluminum plant, right? The paper plant sells 5, the aluminum plant turns around and buys those 5, because it's in both of their interests to do that. So it's cheaper to buy the permits, the aluminum plant buys the 5 permits. Well, they were given 5 for free and they bought 5. So again, their emissions are 10, they abate 0. Their total abatement cost is 0, but they have spent nothing to get rid of emissions, but they had to spend $750 to buy the permits, so they didn't have to get the emissions. So what's the difference between this and the emission charge? What's the difference? What I've written down here versus what the emission charge? So first of all, did we achieve E star either way? Yeah, so that's what's the difference? Yep, so since we gave the permits away for free, the money was just exchanged between both firms. How much revenue did the government collect here? 0. So this is why did economists develop permits? As hopefully a more politically feasible way to achieve the exact same thing. Because if your whole point against charges is you don't want extra revenue to the government, okay, great, give permits away from free and make them tradable. Then now it's just one firm is giving money to the other firm. But you still achieve E star in the least cost way. You just eliminated any of it going to the government because they were given away for free. Is this the next page? Oh yeah, on this page, it's right here. So that's what I have down here. So the aggregate total abatement cost is still 1,000. 1,000 to the paper, 1,000 to the aluminum. We've minimized aggregate total abatement cost. So the conclusion is these transferable discharge permits has also achieved minimizing aggregate total abatement costs just like T-Star. The only difference, as Nick has pointed out here, is With the permits, no revenue has gone to the government. But notice, I have excluded the transfer payment. It's still a transfer payment. One firm paid out 750 and the other firm got 750. If we care about the profits of both firms equally, it's just a transfer. Just forget it. You got more, you got less. We care about both plans equally. It's a transfer payment. You always let that drop out. And so we have treated that transfer payment exactly the same here with the transferable discharge permits as we said when it was going to the government. It was still a transfer payment that we efficiently ignore. But maybe this is more politically feasible because firms are okay giving each other money, but they don't want to pay it into the government as taxes. But that's because these permits were freely distributed. What if we auctioned off the permits and we just said to both firms, you can buy a permit from us for $150. It's the exact same as the emission charge. Then it's exactly the same. Nothing is different at all. If the government auctioned off the permits at $150, then it's as if you just did the emission charge because the aluminum plant is going to say, I'll take 5 for $150, and they voluntarily gave the government that money. So really the only difference between transferable discharge permits and emission charge is if you give the initial distribution of permits is given away for free. That's the only thing different. Otherwise, you accomplish the same thing. So we tried this. The Blackstone-Markey bill, what year was it? I think this was 2009. 19, 15, like 16 years ago. 16 years ago, Blackstone-Markey bill didn't pass the Senate by like 1 or 2 votes. Almost. We almost had climate change legislation in place that would have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 85%. But it didn't pass. And the people opposed to it, it was cap and trade. It was exactly this. Permits given away for free to all firms, all these refineries and fossil fuel producers and cap and trade. But the opposition was like, don't be fooled. It's a tax. So forget it. What the heck? Everybody just saw it was like, it actually wasn't a tax because it was given away for free. But they portrayed it against as if it was a tax, which everyone doesn't like. And so just forget it, right? So we didn't do it. I don't know what to say. This is the best idea economists have. It still didn't happen anyway. So maybe just do the charge. So then it was kind of like, just forget it. But then the next idea was what Canada is doing now. Just forget it. Do a charge and just rebate the money back to citizens. So that's what Canada's doing. So that's where we are. That's a history lesson of trying to get pollution reduced in the least cost way. So let's rank all of these options. Based on efficiency, here's how we would rank all of our options here. This is, I've learned that I really need to add 5 here and not emphasize so much these differences. So first best is an emission charge. Just in T-star, right? This is very important. I'm not just saying any emission charge. The exact perfect emission charge that gets us to E-star. We place a charge on carbon so high that we efficiently reduce emissions of carbon down to 90% less than where we are now. Not just put a little bit on it, like a lot, so that we achieve E-star. Or pollution in the river, or PM 2.5. You place that tax high enough that you achieve E-star. Or if we had auctioned off transferable discharge permits for carbon or PM 2.5, and you auction them off, that's exactly the same. You get the double dividend either way. You've achieved emissions, you reduce emissions in the least cost way, and you raised revenue for the government that can be used to offset other taxes or use it to subsidize environmental public goods or some private good causing an external benefit. Okay, but the double dividend is revenue to the government. So if that seems politically less likely, okay, then just do freely distributed permits, which also achieve E-star, but you don't get any government revenue collected and you lose the double dividend. But all 3 of these options, as we just proved with a simple example here, you've minimized aggregate total abatement costs. You still reduced emissions in the least cost way. There's like 3 examples that we've ever done this. When coal plants were first regulated, sulfur emissions were freely distributed permits. We did do this. And when we phased lead out of gasoline, we did it with permits. So there was like 2 examples. But primarily, so what is the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act? It's uniform emission standards. Like this is 99% of how we reduce emissions in the United States. And so we can still achieve E-star here, right? And so, let's say you achieve E-star, right? We update the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, so we do get the efficient amount of emissions reduced. It's just, but you haven't done it in a way the cheapest way to society. That's what we're emphasizing now in this chapter. Is that we're going to incur extra abatement costs that we needed to because we had uniform. We just made every firm lower emissions, even though some of them could have done it more cheaply than others. So that's what we're emphasizing now. But the main thing I want to emphasize is the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are the 2 most efficient pieces of legislation our government has ever passed. Because if we didn't have it, what's the worst option? Do nothing, right? That's the worst option of all. If we do nothing, that's a massive government failure, because the market failure is then we sit over here at EMAX, and we haven't lowered emissions at all. Like getting to E-star is the most important thing. And okay, once we've done that, then we can argue about, okay, well, is it efficient to get to E-star with a uniform emission standard? Can we do a little bit better with the charge or permits? And this is better. But the most important thing, it's the last chapter, the most important thing is do whatever it takes to reduce emissions to E-star. And so you can achieve that with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. That's option 4. And that's way better than do nothing. You have massive, our terminology here, dead weight loss, right? All of this. We'd be creating all these extra damages to society that would not be needed. So that's the ranking. So this is, like if you told me, can we to vote to strengthen the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act to achieve E-star using uniform emission standards, right, I'm 95% happy. I'd be an extra 5% happier if we use this charge for optional permits, but this is the important thing. That makes sense? That's the important. All right, so I'm out of time. So Now what we're going to do, this is intuitively everything that's in chapters 11, 12, and 13. But we did it with a simple story. So what I'm going to do on Wednesday is do a more realistic story where firms have changing marginal abatement costs as a function of emissions, and then kind of show the same thing but with a more complicated story, and then show some more incentives that charges and permits out. But we're 90% of the way there with just a simple story. All right, so it's got a few minutes left to do your daily writing. I'll finish up talking about these 3 chapters on Wednesday with a more involved story.